Welcome back, everyone. I'm really excited. We have a great guest today. His name is Dr. William von Hippel. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Queensland. That's right. He's in Australia. It's pretty early over there, too. But he's going to join me to talk about his book, The Social Leap. It's a fascinating read. I highly recommend it. You can get it on Amazon. And we're going to take a great look at human behavior. Yeah, we're going to talk about us. So let's not waste any more time. And welcome to the show, Dr. von Hippel. Welcome, sir.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And before we get started, how did you want me to refer to you? Dr. Von Hippel, Bill?
Just Bill, please.
Bill, okay. Just wanted to make sure. Sometimes it's like a Three Stooges show. You have like three doctors on here. So, Bill, tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write this book.
So I'm a social psychologist. I study how people are today, their relationships, the stereotypes they hold, attitudes, et cetera, the standard stuff. And after working on that problem for a good 20 years, I started to feel like what we're answering is how people do what they do now and sort of the immediate motivations, but we're missing this broader picture, which is, well, why do we do that? Why do humans hold stereotypes the way they do? Why do their relationships of the types that they are? And so I started to look farther and farther in the past, and eventually became convinced that one way to help answer that question is to consider the last 6 million years since we departed from our chimpanzee cousins and try to take a deeper dive into what's happened during that time span in order to get an understanding of what underlies human motivation.
That's a heck of a longitudinal study there you got going on.
It is, and there's a little bit of missing data, but we do the best we can.
So what happened? So take us through that journey. What happened in the beginning? What do we see?
So now remember, this is to the best of our knowledge right now, and like everything else in academics, all the details are arguable, but here's the way I understand the story. So basically around 6 million years ago, what you've got is there's for the last, at that point in time, for a good 25 million years, there's been upwelling on the East African side of the Great African Rift Valley because of the tectonic activity that takes place in the rift. And as a consequence of that upwelling, what you've got is rainforest on the east side of the rift is slowly drying out. By 6 million years ago, there's very little rainforest left. It's just scattered patches. And so what you have is this chimp-like ancestor of ours who prior to that had been living on both sides of the rift in the trees, and they're kings of the canopy. But now as the rainforest starts to disappear, they're forced more and more out onto the ground. And so the question is, what happens to these sort of chimp-like beings who are now forced to cover ground when that's not really their strength? They're slow on the ground. They're not very dangerous on the ground because their weaponry, they're acrobatic in the trees, but their knees can't even lock, their hips can't straighten out. They're not very good on the ground. And so suddenly they're vulnerable to predators that they didn't care about when they're in the trees. And they're even vulnerable to predators they didn't even know existed in the trees, like lions were irrelevant to their lives. And so they've got all these new predators. They've got all the food sources that they used to live on are disappearing. And then how do they solve that problem? My guess is that if you're like God of your own planet and you reran that little evolutionary story 100 times, 99 times out of 100, we end up as worthless little weak beings if we're even alive, kind of skirting the edges of the savannah. But we got lucky, and their story is our story, as the solutions that they arrived at slowly led to us.
That's amazing. You made some great points they just didn't even think about. That's right. Different types of predators they had to be forced to encounter now when they go to the ground. So you mentioned in your book you have 3 points in the evolutionary process, right? That really were big points of leap, I guess, as you would refer to them. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So by leap, really, I mean, that's metaphorically. So that social leap is the first inflection point that you're probably discussing, which is, so by 3.5 million years ago, our ancestors had developed bipedalism. And so we know that because we have some really lucky fossil evidence, and we have some really lucky even footprints that we can now model with computers and see that they could lock their knees and that their hips were straight up like ours. And so we know that Australopithecines, that's those ancestors, were walking upright. And the consequence of walking upright is it changes the shape and orientation of your body. So our prior ancestors, all their musculature was oriented vertically so that they could go up and down trees. And now when you're living on the savannah and you're bipedal, your musculature is oriented laterally because you deal with things forward in space rather than upward. What it also allows you to do is achieve much greater rotation. And so chimpanzees are very stiff if they try to rotate side to side. We have these long waists and with these flexible arms, shoulders, and wrists. And all that comes together to allow what is widely regarded as the greatest invention in military history, which is the capacity to kill at a distance. And so prior to Australopithecines, chimpanzees can throw stones, but very poorly. Their musculature is not lined up for it. But once we get to Australopithecines, who are now bipedal and walking upright, they can engage in throwing like a human does, which is, if you watch people throw the ball at a beach, you might think it's all just shoulder and maybe a little bit of arm, but it's actually a full body motion. To throw properly, you step forward with the opposite leg, your hips start to rotate, then your shoulders start to rotate, then your elbow comes out, and at the very end, your wrist snaps. Now, the reason that matters is it turns out that when you model the action of throwing, the sort of musculature and skeletal actions of throwing, it ends up being that the reason throwing works so well is it generates an enormous amount of elastic energy. It's like the snapping of a rubber band as your tendons, ligaments, and muscles all stretch all the way out and then snap through at the end. And bipedalism allowed us to do that by the rotational capacity of our hips and shoulders, by the greater flexibility in our arms, because we're no longer using them like legs to climb trees. And so by about 3.5 million years ago, we know that our ancestors had the capacity to kill at a distance. And what I believe, and what a number of scholars believe, is that changed everything. Because prior to that, there's really little to be gained by being cooperative with each other. And if you look at chimpanzees, they are far more competitive with each other than they are cooperative. But by the time you get to us, we're way more cooperative than we are competitive, because once we could kill at a distance, now all those nasty predators on the savannah that could come after us, well, previously we would just scatter to the trees and hope that it eats you and not me. But once we could kill at a distance, now we could pelt it with stones at a position of relative safety. And so it meant that now, rather than being motivated to be competitive and hoping that it eats you and not me, we're actually motivated to work together. And so for the first time in our ancestral history, the group's goals align with the individual goals, which creates this evolutionary, very powerful force whereby we now start to become effective groups rather than collections of individuals who can sometimes do a good job when we're together.
So fascinating. I do a lot of situational awareness consulting, so my mind was racing through thinking about that and thinking about terrorist groups and social identity theory and collectivism and all that stuff. It's just kind of floating around in my head. So I'm trying to form a question, folks. It's interesting too. You mentioned the throwing, because I used to be a pitcher, so you're exactly right about everything about that. So the collectivism, individualism, you touched upon that in your book as well, if I remember correctly. What did you gather out of that? Because it's funny, because we learned how to become groups, as you mentioned, but then those groups started arguing with other groups and having conflict.
Yes.
And
and
kind of like the Roberts case.
Yeah, no, it's an unfortunate truth about human nature. But so this original pressure was just to get us all to be more collectivist. So if you think about chimpanzees, highly individualistic, they would literally, if you set up experiments, they'd rather forage and do things on their own than in groups. We would, if you do the experiments with us, even when little children, immediately we're this group-oriented species. So we're highly collectivistic. Now, that doesn't mean the individualism was erased. It just means that there's this collectivism overlays. But nonetheless, once we get to the point where we can now throw and protect ourselves on the savannah, now we've created this whole new psychology. And this is what I refer to as the social leap. I mean, it's not really a leap. It took 3.5 million years at least. But by then, what we've now got is a social solution to this physical problem of being forced out on the savannah. And that social solution now creates a new interesting circumstance, which is that by virtue of working together, now we have, for the first time again in our evolutionary line, because of this alignment of individual and group goals, we have all sorts of opportunities where our groups can gain emergent properties beyond that of single individuals if they can learn to work together better. And what that means is that if we get a little bit smarter, there's going to be a huge return on that investment in our capacity to not just survive, but also to hunt and gather and to get better and higher quality food so that we can pay the rent on that bigger piece of brain. And so that social solution that we arrived at, that collectivism that it created in us, created groups that now started to have properties whereby, like, let's imagine division of labor. If a group could start having division of labor and you do X and I'll do Y, they can be more effective than if we're all just madly trying to do X. And what about planning? If we can start to say, well, when that mastodon comes down through the valley, you be there and I'll be here, and then we'll roll the stones down. Again, that goes tightly with division of labor, and it creates in our groups emergent properties that individuals don't have. And now we know that, for the best of our evidence, suggests that Australopithecines couldn't do that, but we know that by Homo erectus they could. And I could talk about how we know that if you'd like, but at any rate, what that means is that by somewhere between 1.5 million and 2 million years ago, now groups have emergent properties that individuals don't have. And that starts to bring us back to the top of the food chain, but it also means that our greatest threat is no longer the large predators that have been hunting us on the savannah. Our greatest threat is actually other groups of humans, hominins, whatever stage we're at, because they too have division of labor, they too have planning. And so now a mastodon or a saber-toothed tiger is not a threat to me if I'm in my group, we can handle it. But another group could well be a big threat. And that creates this inherent tribalism where we've evolved to cooperate with each other, but we haven't necessarily evolved to cooperate with other groups. And in fact, Richard Wrangham has these wonderful data where he shows, if you look at violence within group among chimpanzees, it's about 500 times higher than within group violence among humans. But if you look at between group violence among chimpanzees, it's 1-to-1 with between group violence in humans. And so we've gotten way friendlier and domesticated compared to chimps and how we interact with fellow group members, but we haven't gotten any friendlier at all in the way we manage and handle members of other groups.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, was that the last leap? I don't know if I should keep asking questions, wait till we get to the very end of the leaps, but is there another leap after this?
Well, so these are inflection points, right? And so the first inflection point is this desire to work together. The second inflection point is really division of labor and planning and all that gained us. And I think the third inflection point is agriculture and the consequent development of cities and all the sorts of expertise that we now take advantage of today. And that led to writing, that led to making our cumulative culture all the more cumulative because it's not just storytelling anymore. You know, a small child today has access to the ideas of Darwin or Copernicus or Galileo. And so what only the geniuses of their time knew then, you know, you learn in 5th grade now. And so unlike any other animal on this planet, our culture just ratchets up steadily. And so you and I are taking advantage of that. We're sitting thousands of miles apart using machinery that neither of us could build or develop. In fact, no one human being on the planet could build or develop any of the stuff that we've got in our houses that allow us to do all this. And that's that cumulative nature that came about really by virtue of agriculture, creating societies that could get larger. I mean, it's a bad deal for them, but it was a great deal for us down the track because eventually it led to all the science and technology that we take advantage of.
Sure, Copernicus and Darwin are not going to be too happy the 5th graders are learning that stuff. Probably like, what?
No, I'd be yes and no, right? I'd be over the moon if 5th graders study what I do.
Now, when did that last inflection point happen, you think? Was it 6,000 years ago or with the Israelites?
So
what's going on?
Yeah, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, the first big city that we know of is Uruk in eastern Iraq. And by 5,000 years ago, there were I think if I remember right, 50,000 people lived there, miles of walls. They have these big temples that you can still see. Now that one doesn't exist anymore because the Euphrates moved over some good 100 miles away from it. And so now it sits in the desert. It was just sort of bad luck. It would have been a really lovely, very fertile place to live 5,000 years ago, and now it's not. But within 1,000 years of the development of this city, you can see their trade goods all over the Middle East. You can see pottery and also agriculture, all sorts of evidence of these actual cities. Now we've got lots of settlements before that. Settlements go back 20,000 years. We have human beings starting to live in semi-permanent settlements even prior to agriculture because they're basically just living in areas where lots of these natural wheats and stuff grow on their own. And so we can see even grindstones for wheat, for cereals, 20,000 years prior to the actual onset of agriculture itself, which agriculture is a good 10 to 12,000 years old. So these things all happen super slowly, but slowly, you get, once you're farming, you don't want to leave the area you are. And if you're in a really good area like Uruk was at the time, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger because that's the place to be. And then all sorts of emergent opportunities develop with the advent of cities.
Fascinating stuff. I got a couple of questions. I've got a lot of questions already popped up, but I guess we'll start now with that background information. Folks, again, Social Leap is the book. Bill von Hippel, Vonhippel, if you're listening on the podcast. It's a great book. Definitely got to read it. Let me ask you this. I guess the first thing, we talked a little bit about tribalism, collectivism, and that inflection point seemed, as you mentioned, progresses into the next inflection point, but never really leaves. It's kind of funny. No. It stays there and it just kind of works among the next inflection point. While the other one, the very first one, did disappear on us in a certain degree. How do we reconcile that? Can you give us some insight what you found out about human behavior and that nature? Because now we're going to get into how does it explain everything about us?
Yeah, so tribalism is a really unfortunate quality of human nature, right? It makes us super suspicious of members of other groups. It makes us prepared to dislike them. But the one good piece of news about all that is that tribalism it's not an automatic negativity. So if you look at people's automatic reactions, they have an automatic positivity toward their own group. So they automatically group favor. And of course, that's enough to create discrimination. I hire you because you're a member of my group. I just don't bother hiring you because you're not a member of my group. And that sort of discrimination is going to always be hard to beat. But the good thing about it is that although other groups were often a threat to our ancestors, other groups were also often an opportunity. We know that because we know about these trade networks that are really, really old, many tens of thousands of years old. And so what that means is that sometimes when my group encountered your group, and by that I mean we're different linguistic groups really, because we would have larger groups that we would move around amongst of all of us who, like if we're the Hadza in northern Tanzania, you and I are in a camp together, there's 20 of us, and then we get arguing and we're sick of each other, and we just, when you go west, I go east, and we connect up with other Hadza. So there's these larger shell groups that we all existed in, and they're basically friendly. But when you encounter somebody who's not Hadza, now there's the potential for conflict. But the good news is that there's also the potential for trade. There's also the potential that maybe some of the men or women from my group will shift to your group and thereby decrease the risk of inbreeding. All sorts of good things can come about by virtue of intergroup contact. And so the end result of that process is that we actually are deeply ambivalent about other groups. We're prepared to like them, but we're also easily prepared to dislike them. And so what that in turn means is that if you set up the structures of contact, then you can make it so that we actually come to really be fond of other groups. And so think about all the tourism that you've ever done or that you've seen other people doing, where you're immersed in a totally new culture. You're excited about the food. You're excited about learning about their ways of doing things. And so it's not that you have this feeling of dislike, but if something goes wrong, conflict quickly emerges. But so long as it doesn't go wrong, if we can do a good job keeping people to be benefiting from each other rather than harming each other, then we can never, I don't believe we can eliminate it, but we can make it highly unlikely to emerge.
Yeah, hopefully you're right. Absolutely. There's a couple things I wanted to talk about too, because I know it's amazing how we are as human beings. We tend to categorize quickly, and we quickly get into these groups. I mean, you can see it all different aspects from the Super Bowl coming up this weekend, folks. I'm sorry, I'm not following it, so I really don't know who's playing. But you have the different teams, and you immediately got, again, tribalism develops there. Tribalism
Yep.
develops. I deal a lot with the criminal world, so we look at tribalism in the gang world, one gang versus another gang in territories, as we've seen over, I'm sure, millions of years, trying to protect our own territory.
Yep.
Um, I guess my question now, we talked about it before the interview, which was kind of funny because we were talking about Dr. Trivers and our self-deception, but yes, in your book, you also discuss why we believe our own lies.
Yeah.
What's the benefit of that?
So this is an idea that Trivers proposed good 50 years ago, almost in the mid 70s. He first wrote it down in the foreword to Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. He proposed this idea, which is that deceit is common in the animal world. We can see animals deceiving each other all the time because, of course, evolution works by any means necessary. Evolution is an amoral force. And so if you come upon a strategy that makes you more effective as either a predator or as avoiding predators, or makes you more capable of attracting mates, well, that quality that you developed is going to proliferate in the next generation. And so what Trivers argued is that given the consequences of that process, and given the fact that deception has the potential to be everywhere, that we also evolve the capacity to self-deceive, and that we do that in order to prevent others from seeing through our deceptive ruse. Now, it's arguable how much other animals need to self-deceive, but I think the data actually suggests, there's even interesting data with crabs that suggests that they might be deceiving themselves, right? Which is, I'm happy to chat about if you like. It's some pretty funky data, but the end result is that if you can believe your own lie, then you become more effective. And let me give you a for example about why. If you're a cheetah and I'm a gazelle, well, our interaction is going to end in death of one of us. Either I escape you and you die of starvation, or you catch me and eat me. So there's not much point in posturing and trying to tell you don't bother chasing me, although there's a little bit of that. but in humans, let's say that you and I are fighting over the girl or the bar stool or the business opportunity, right? both of us, neither of us wants to fight. We just want to know who's going to win that fight and have the other person defer. Because even if you pound the crap out of me, when you're done, your knuckles are sore and you're kind of wishing that you had brought your baseball bat, which you unfortunately left at home. And so it's costly biologically for both the winner and the loser. And so what happens when conspecifics or members of the same species come into conflict is they have elaborate ritual signaling to try to figure out who's going to win. And part of that ritual signaling gives you the opportunity to bluff a little bit, right? To sell yourself as being a little bit bigger than you are. So you and I have just met for the first time. I'm telling you to move off this bar seat. This is where I always sit. And you're looking at me going, he's kind of old and desiccated. I think I could take him. But then you're also thinking, he looks pretty confident in himself. He knows himself better than I know him. Maybe it's not worth the conflict today. Maybe I should let him have that bar stool and I'll just move over too. And so if I can bluff you successfully, I can get things that I really wouldn't get if you knew exactly what I am and who I am. And all conflicts between members of the same species have that quality because nobody wants to fight. They just want to know who would win. And they're willing to sacrifice a little bit of accuracy to avoid the conflict and avoid the costs. What that means is that if I can really believe my bluff, then I might win more. And the way to believe it, or the way to bluff most effectively, is if I totally believe it. I think I'm Bill plus 20%. And Bill plus 20 can just take Carlos plus 10. And so I get you to back off, right? And so that's this process. And the problem is, of course, that it generates all sorts of negative consequences down the road. It can help you as an individual, but it can lead to all sorts of cascading problems by virtue of people constantly seeing their own motive as just, seeing the other people's behaviors as hypocritical, but not their own, et cetera. And so right now in the United States, for example, we see both parties continually accusing the other party of hypocrisy. And of course, they're both right. Human beings are hypocritical by nature. We evolved to be that way, but unfortunately, we also evolved to be kind of blind to our own hypocrisy because we need to believe it. It makes us more effective, but we're very capable of seeing through the hypocrisy of others if we're, when we're on the lookout for it.
Yeah, I always wanted to do a book on hypocrisy, but I knew everybody would hate me at that point.
Yeah, I'm afraid it would. Yeah.
Is there an overlap here? Or is it just another way of saying self-serving bias, or is there some kind of connection?
No, it's definitely a self-serving bias. And the key is that the notion underlying it is that you actually come to believe it yourself. And so when we collect all these data and we look at, and you try to look at overconfidence, you can do it in ways where you can really see that the person believes it. My favorite experiment is one done by Nick Epley and Aaron Whitchurch at the University of Chicago. And what they did, this really lovely study where they brought people into the lab and they morphed their faces with the face of somebody more attractive or less attractive. And then they asked them, which one of these faces is you? The original one, or these things have been increasingly morphed to be better or worse looking. Now, think about what you'd be like as a participant in that study. You know that they have the actual photo. They know which one's the truth. And so if you claim to be if I claim I'm Bill plus 20%, I'm that better looking photo, I'm gonna make a schmuck of myself, right? Because you're gonna laugh and go, my friend, that is not you. You're the ugly guy right there in the middle, right? And yet on average, people chose the photo that was morphed to be 20% better looking. And in a subsequent study, they could find that photo more rapidly than they could find their real photo. Now, if you think about yourself and what would you, it's an amazing effect. And if you think about, well, would I do this? In my mind, when I think about the answer to that question, I reflect on the fact that most of the candid photos that people take of me are ugly. They're not as good looking as I know I really am. And what that tells you is that I'm deluded about how good looking I really am, because the candid photos reflect what I really am. And I happen to choose that one photo taken in the perfect lighting at the perfect angle where I looked halfway acceptable. And that's what I think I look like, and that's what I put on my Facebook profile. That's what I put up on Tinder if I'm young and single, et cetera. And so we can just think about the fact that if we think 80% of the candid photos that people take of us are bad photos, it's probably a sign that we're not as good looking as we think we are.
I don't think I could. All the photos you showed me would have to be better looking than I am. I can see that. Let me ask you this. Now you kind of lead me into the world of social media. It was funny because I was talking to a group last night, and there's a couple concepts. One is the generation me concept that's starting to develop in today's world with social media. But we were talking about photoshopping, and we don't really know who's who anymore out there. What anybody looks like, because everything is kind of weird. What's your take on that? Would you explain that with your theory?
Well, it's a funny business, right? So if you look back if you remember these days, when I was a kid, let's say you wanted to find a date, and you wanted to go through the media. You didn't want to go to a bar and meet her.
Hmm.
You put an ad up in a personals column and you'd say a little bit about yourself. I don't know if you remember this, but it'd be like SWM, single white male. Because of course you don't want to waste money on words.
Yeah.
And then you'd say 28 years old, bubbly bub. And it turns out that when people go back and look at those personal ads, and there's no photo because it was too expensive and too low quality. Well, it turns out when you go back and analyze those personal ads, men were always claiming to be taller than they were. Women were claiming to be younger than they were. You know, they were making the kind of standard lies that you wouldn't, that don't surprise you until you think about the fact that the person's going to meet you. And so you'd think that it's going to become obvious that I'm not 6'2" when I actually meet the girl. And I think what people did in those days is they tried to get their foot in the door. And so they told these lies that they thought, well, you know, that's close enough. And my guess is that we're doing the exact same thing with Photoshop, only in a more sophisticated way. There, you know, you're lying, but you were sort of saying, well, this is close enough. You know, this picture of me isn't as good looking as I really am. Let me put a little more hair on my head. Let me, you know, let me Photoshop some muscle in here. And that's kind of more reflective about really who I am. And it allows you to make this argument to yourself that's kind of the self-deluded argument where you know you're lying, but you're lying in a way where you think you're representing an underlying truth. And I actually think that that's a big part of Trump's charm in America, is that he, for his followers, they know that he might be telling a specific lie. Like a really early one was that he saw Muslims dancing in the street after 9/11. Well, there's no video of that. So, I mean, he didn't claim he saw it out his window. He claimed he saw these videos, but they don't exist. But I think what people say is, well, I bet Muslims were doing that. And so it doesn't really matter if he did or didn't see a video. He's telling truth in the sense that that's probably how it really went down, even if they were doing it privately in their own homes. And so what they're distinguishing between is, well, materially, that's a lie, but it's reflecting a deeper underlying truth. And I think that when people Photoshop, they're doing something similar. They're saying, materially, this is a lie. I don't actually have all that hair that I'm now pasting to my head in my video, in my image, but actually I'm the kind of guy who looks good enough when you get to know me that it's as if I have hair. And so you're trying to create an underlying reality, even though you know you're putting a little more frosting on that cake than really belongs.
Interesting. Yeah, because obviously my background is psychology, so it kind of reminds me of the actual self versus the ideal self.
Yeah.
That challenge that Rogers had, and Jungian as well, with that persona. We're always trying to show a certain type of personality to individuals. Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. Now, you went into in your book, you also talk about fame and fortune, which you kind of gets. We can jump off from this one too, because we see a lot of that coming up. You mentioned Trump and his other individuals out there that. Well, actually, there's a special, I think, coming out on Netflix or HBO or something, talking about deep fakes and all this stuff and how people are actually not really as popular as they seem. But anyway, we'll get back to fame and fortune. Tell us about that in the book, and does it overlap with that at all?
So fame and fortune is something that we've all evolved to want, even though we didn't live in a world where there was fame and fortune were possible, but we did live in a world where we had a very small social network, and maybe I'm the coolest guy, or maybe I'm the best singer, or maybe I make the best arrowheads. I mean, I live in such a small social group that I've got a decent chance at being literally the best human I know at something, whether it's totally related like to survival, like making arrowheads, whether it's related to being popular in my group, like telling stories, which allows them to learn and therefore benefit from my expertise, whether it's just being fun to be around, charismatic or whatever. And so we actually evolved in a world where I could be famous, so to speak, for something because everybody knows Bill is the funny guy or is the good arrowhead maker. And now we live in a world where that's just not possible, right? I can't be the funniest, smartest, tall. I can't be anything because there's a gazillion humans out there. And so what we tying into that ancestral tendency is we have this deep-seated desire to be famous and be loved by everybody. And the only way that that's actually, we can now kind of make that possible if I got millions of followers on TikTok, if I am a TV star, if I'm all those things. And the problem is that I think for our ancestors, that really did make them happy, because if I'm the best arrow maker in my group, well, you guys are never going to want to get rid of me. You know, even if I'm a schmuck in other ways, or if I have terrible halitosis, whatever my problem is, you guys are going to say, well, Bill makes great arrows. I just want to have him around. And so it was enormously beneficial to me to be valuable to my group in that way and to be the best at something. And so now that evolved tendency turns into us, this preference, this desire we have for fame, but it's not going to make us happy in the same way, because there's all sorts of negative consequences that come with fame that our ancestors just didn't have to deal with. As the best arrowhead maker in our group, you guys just patted me on the back and asked me, hey, how's the arrowhead coming along? but I wasn't stalked by the paparazzi when I went to the store. If I yelled at my kid, it wasn't on the front page of the newspaper. You lose all semblance of a private and reasonable life when you become famous in today's world. And so we all pursue that. We all think we want it. And then if you look at what famous people do, the most fun they ever have is going back and doing things that the rest of us get to do every day. You know, they have the advantage of nicer houses because they're rich, right? And they have advantages of bodyguards to keep people away from them. But in the end, they're living like less good versions of the life that we get to lead because nobody knows who we are. So I can go shopping if I want to and nobody mobs me. I can go to Disney World and do the rides and nobody, you know, I can be left alone as human beings when human beings want to be. But if you're rich and famous, it's just not an option anymore.
It's a great point. It's a great point. People don't realize that a lot too. There's a lot of liberty that these individuals lose, and maybe they weren't even aware of it. I mean, they're starting to. I look back at Elvis Presley and some of these individuals, and you can tell. At least I thought I could tell. And man, it was shocking to them what was happening because they couldn't really understand it. There was nobody really before them that had that level because
and if you, I don't know if you've seen that wonderful Netflix series on Michael Jordan, where they work through. I can't even remember the name of it now. It's this long series about the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan. I'm blanking on the title, but there's a number of scenes in the book where you can see the cost of his fame, where all he wants to do is escape, and he's just trying to get away. And he's like, you know, lying on a couch in the middle of. He's just trying to be away from people so that he can relax and not have photographs of himself, you know, farting or picking his nose or doing all the things that a human being might do that suddenly you look ghastly if you do that when you're famous. And so you could see that cost there. You could see it in Michael Jackson and the way he was hounded. You could see it in Elvis Presley. And then you can even see it in sort of the next level down of famous. I remember reading this interview with Robert Pattinson, you know, that the guy who played the actor who, and he talked about, they said, well, what did you do for your birthday? He goes, oh, I had the greatest day. And then he literally described the day that you and I have every day, where through some elaborate complex ruse, he and his old friend snuck into a bar and nobody knew they were there and they just hung out. And I was like, you know, I can walk in the front door and I can have that exact same day. I can just tell my friends, meet me there at 9 o'clock.
And so they pay this too, huh, Bill?
Yeah.
I mean, it can change like that, Robert. It can change.
Yeah. I mean, somebody like that, they went from they're not known to, and in social media, you can become famous overnight, right? And then suddenly everybody wants a piece of you.
I mean, in a week or two, it's just like Robert's life just boom, changed completely. Yeah. It's an excellent example. Man. And I guess as we get ready to wrap up, folks, I could be out all day with him, I tell you. But again, book Socially Before I Forget. William Von Hippel, definitely get it on Amazon if you have it. Fascinating read to understand more about who we are. It looks like the tribalism and some of the characteristics we've been talking about has moved from the terra firma, I guess we could call it, into the ether now, as we were saying with cyber and Twitter. We're seeing these tribes kind of forming in these worlds now. What do you think that is? Is it something, I don't want to ask that, but how about, do you foresee any negative ramifications in the future? I'm really against social media in a lot of aspects because it's really turned ugly over the last 5 years. It was pretty nice initially. It's just me connecting with old friends, and now it's turned into this wild west kind of atmosphere.
Well, for me, the biggest problem with social media is that all of us were young and stupid once. And even some of us are old and stupid often, right? And if I think of all the things that I've said and done, and I imagine that they're now emblazoned upon the universe to be permanently viewed, nobody would like me. I would be shunned from every group that I'm a part of because I've used all sorts of negative words for members of other groups. I behaved like an asshole. I've done all sorts of things that a human being tends to do, but I was blessed that when I was younger and stupider, I lived in a world where you said it and it just disappeared after it was said. So my friends would say, how could you say that? Or I'm angry, or, you know, we could resolve the issue then and there. And now I can be embarrassed about it. I can regret that I said that, but I can be forgiven because those who I said it to are my actual friends. And they, you know, let's say I made an ethnic slur to a friend of mine when I'm a kid and he's Black and he says, hey, that's totally not cool at all. And he can confront me about it. We can talk about it. I can feel really guilty. I can not do it again, but the world doesn't know. And now I'm not shunned from all my groups. I'm not fired from my job, etc. Well, now we've got these kids who put up on social media this stupid stuff. It's admittedly stupid stuff, but now it's stuck there for the world to see. And we've seen all these cases where someone gets unadmitted from Harvard because they went on this stupid rant on their Facebook page. They get fired from their job. I saw recently a country star, he used the N-word, I think, when he was drunk and yelling at some friends. Now, I don't know the guy. I don't know if he's racist or not, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's not racist, but he was drunk and stupid. And that information, it's kind of inside all of us. We all lived in a world where it's suffused with that, and it can pop out when we don't mean it. Now, drunk is like one of the classic times of don't mean it. Your frontal lobes aren't working very well. Again, I don't know him. I don't know if he's a racist guy, but let's just assume for the sake of argument he's not, because there's every chance he isn't. His career's in shambles now because of something that went up and is on social media and is now just sitting there permanently. And I would love it if a person could apologize like in the old days and just be forgiven, but we don't seem to be there right now. We seem to be in a world where the strangers who don't know him, who don't know if that's really what he's like or not, just pile on top of him. And that's an unforgivable career-ending act. And we've seen that over and over again with kids who are getting denied admission to their colleges or unadmitted. And not just Harvard. There was a case at University of Tennessee, if I remember right, recently, similar story. And then we see that with all sorts of these kinds of cases. And the cost is that when you're young and stupid, you don't realize putting this in social media creates this permanent print on the world. Whereas when I was a kid, you just couldn't do that. And so I was saved from myself.
It leads us right back to hypocrisy and self-deception, back into that world again, because you have these individuals using control. And yeah, it's a very dangerous world out there. You made a point I wanted to bring up. It just kind of came up right now before we get ready to wrap up here. Memory. It seems like memory was also, in a weird sense, a conspirator, co-conspirator with us and our self-deception, isn't it? Because we remember things. Like I always use the example of baseball. If I struck out 8 guys in a game, 10 years later, it's 12 guys, 15 years, how it goes. How does that play a role in this?
It plays a huge role. We tend to remember and reflect upon the things that we did well. And so those tend to be what we stay in us. But look, it's also the case, thankfully, that our memory, we can also be self-punishing and our memory can go the other way. And to come back to the point I was making before, I remember a friend of mine is gay and he and I were chatting. I've known him for a very long time. And I used a homophobic slur just on accident in the conversation, probably because I grew up in a world when I was a little kid, that was literally the worst thing you could say about somebody, was to use some anti-gay term. I didn't know I knew anyone who was gay, because in the 1960s and 70s, you just didn't come out of the closet unless you're incredibly brave, because the punishment was so strong. But I remember using that slur, and then immediately, I couldn't believe what I'd said. I apologized to him. He said, "Look, Bill, it's no big deal. I know you didn't mean it." But for months, I felt guilty about it. And so I would say this. I would say that on average, we remember that baseball game where we struck out 8 guys, and in fact, eventually it becomes 12, and we all do that in a big way. But the good news on that side is we also, we've designed to learn from our mistakes. And when we make a bad one, we have this self-conscious emotion of guilt, and that guilt emotion causes us to just stew in it and reflect on it and make sure we don't ever do it again. And the good news is I really did learn my lesson, right? I haven't done that ever since. And that was a good 15, 20 years ago. So memory can be really helpful. It's evolved for this kind of purpose. 9 times out of 10, it creates this false world for us where we remember this rosy, well, not necessarily rosy, but it's a world where Bill comes off smelling really well compared to what he was really like. And not everything about the world is good. There's some bad things that happen, but somehow Bill kind of meanders his way through in the remembered world. And then the one positive side of that is it's very socially self-correcting. When we do things wrong, those stew in our mind, we vow never to do them again. And it really does work. Learning is really hard when you only have one episode. But if you have one episode that you reflect on 1,000 times, it's the equivalent of 1,000 episodes. And then you really learn well from that. So the memory serves us both in the self-deceptive way, but also in a self-corrective way.
It's interesting, because I know I'm doing a lot of work right now with trauma, individuals with child abuse, and the correlations between that and criminal behavior and whatnot. But it's interesting, when I'm listening to you, it reminds me of, we have 2 different worlds we're protecting. We're protecting our outside world, our physical aspects of ourselves, right, from threats like a lion or another group. But internally, we're protecting our own psyche, in a sense, with our memories. It's almost like an evolutionary safeguard.
Yeah, and there's the reason we need to do that is that there's nothing more important than my reputation. The day you decide that I'm more cost than benefit is the day I get pushed out on an ice floe, never to be seen again, or whacked in the back of the head. And so my reputation is critically important. And so I use my memory to bolster my self-beliefs. I kind of try to put away the things that I don't like as much. I try to reflect on the things that do. And then I can come across to you. I meet you and I seem confident. I seem like a good guy. And you think, oh, I want Bill to be part of my team. And so I can use my memory to enhance my reputation to myself, and then to carry that off and enhance it with others. And there's probably nothing more important than that process, because it allows you, none of us are perfect. All of us have costs, and it allows you to minimize those costs, maximize the benefits, and then go forward with the kind of confidence you need for other people to choose you and want to be around you.
Fascinating discussion. Fascinating discussion. Like I told you, we could be here all day. This is not a Joe
It'd be my
Rogan show,
pleasure.
so we don't go that long.
Yeah.
A fascinating discussion indeed. The Social Leap, everybody. William von Hippel. I highly recommend it. If you've enjoyed this conversation, you're going to like the book even better. Bill, thank you so much for being here. We truly appreciate it.
Totally my pleasure. I enjoyed chatting with you.
Likewise, we're going to have to bring you back. We're going to have to bring you
I'd
back.
love to. Count on it.
Thank you very much. Again, folks, Social Leap, go get it. If you want to support our podcast, make sure to share and subscribe. Check out our other podcasts as well. And if you're on our YouTube channel, you can go check out our podcast at Apple and Spotify. If you're on our podcast, you can check out our YouTube channel and check it out, The Dr. Carla Show. Thanks, everyone, for listening.